Imagine dawn light filtering through leaves, moss green on bark, raw umber beneath your feet, a thin wash of parchment gold on the page of a day not yet written. Rousseau whispers, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Not iron, but mirrors. Chains that click each time a glance becomes a scoreboard. Before the crowd, appetite asked simply, eat, rest, learn. After the crowd, appetite rehearses, pose, compare, win. Which voice set your morning tempo? So society ruins us. Not you alone, the reflex that asks, who's watching? Rousseau splits desire into two pulses. Amour de Soi, the quiet instinct to live and care, and Amour-propre, the restless hunger to be prized. One builds from contact with reality, the other edits reality to protect a mask. If applause disappeared for a month, which work of yours would keep its rhythm? Look at your last decision. Coffee, route, message, tone. Was it chosen for use or for view? If mirrors vanished, which goals would survive? If rankings slept, which friendships would remain awake? Be exact. What stays when nobody is counting? A small practice. Take one unposted walk under trees, eat one plain meal with attention, read one page by window light, and stop when the page ends. Then listen for the aftertaste, calmer or craving. If calm, you met Amour de Soi. If craving, you've been borrowing other people's weather. This is the wager of our hour together. To learn the difference between being good and looking brilliant, between natural need and manufactured hunger, between a self that grows like tree rings and a mask that grows like noise. The path is simple, not easy. Step off the plaza, enter the clearing, begin where breath gets quiet and choices get honest. Part 1. State of nature versus society. Rousseau begins by distinguishing two baselines for human conduct: a natural baseline and a social baseline. In the state of nature, needs are limited, direct, and proportional to survival and simple well-being. The operative motive is Amour de Soi, self-preservation joined to basic curiosity and non-theatrical regard for others. In this register, actions answer to reality with minimal mediation. When did you last make a decision whose justification did not depend on being noticed? Society introduces a second baseline. With comparison, ranking, and spectatorship, the dominant motive shifts toward amour-propre, a comparative drive that seeks esteem and judges success by reflected judgment. The same action begins to serve a secondary goal: appearance. Which recent choice of yours would remain unchanged if no one could verify, record, or praise it? Rousseau does not argue that society is intrinsically corrupt. He claims that comparison distorts scale. By placing individuals under continuous mutual evaluation, society manufactures artificial needs, tokens that signify standing rather than satisfy life. Recognition, beneficial in moderate amounts, becomes a substitute for direct contact with tasks, persons, and things. Where has recognition displaced function in your routine? Food presented for display, work arranged for proof rather than result, speech adjusted for effect rather than accuracy. The distortion can be described operationally. First, mediation increases. Acts are filtered through an imagined audience. Second, incentives drift. Outcomes are selected for visibility. Third, dependence grows. Mood follows external approval cycles. Which of these three mechanisms is most active in your day, and on what evidence? A corrective follows from the same analysis. The aim is not isolation, but calibration. Recover the natural baseline sufficiently to re-enter social life with proportion. 3 practical checks are adequate. 1. Source audit. Take one desire and trace it backward. Body, need, symbol, audience. At which link did the audience become decisive? 2. Evidence fast. Complete one task without leaving any record of completion. Measure satisfaction afterward. 3. Setting test. Adjust a workspace so that accuracy is easier than display. Fewer reflective prompts, clearer procedures, defined endpoints. Which single change would reduce performative pressure most? Rousseau's contention is that moral clarity depends on scale. When needs are modest and information flows from contact with reality, actions tend to remain proportionate. When signals are dominated by esteem, actions inflate and drift. Which of your goals would retain the same priority if prestige variables were removed from the calculation? 2 concluding criteria help to judge progress. Sufficiency. Does an ordinary good, bread, rest, a completed unit of work, feel complete without narrative enhancement? Transferability. Would the same choice be acceptable across settings, alone, with intimates, in public, without alteration of motive? If the answer to both is yes, the choice likely reflects Amour de Soi rather than Amour-propre. If not, the deficit is not in capacity, but in calibration. Reduce mediation, re-specify the task, and let the result answer to life, not to spectacle. Part 2. Amour de Soi versus Amour-propre. Rousseau distinguishes 2 organizing motives that generate different habits of attention and different patterns of error. Amour de Soi names a direct concern for preservation, competence, and modest well-being. It evaluates conduct by contact with reality. A task is judged by whether it solves the problem, food by whether it nourishes, study by whether ability improves. Amour-propre names a comparative concern for esteem. It evaluates conduct by reflected judgment. An act is sized by how it appears, whether it raises rank, and how it will be received. The distinction is not moralism, but a difference in measurement. Under Amour de Soi, feedback loops are short and local. Correction is timely, and learning compounds. Under Amour-propre, loops lengthen and depend on audiences. Signals grow volatile, delay increases, and correction is often replaced by impression management. In such conditions, the same behavior drifts. Decisions prioritize optics over function, and endurance tracks attention rather than purpose. 3 analytic axes clarify the split. Criterion: fitness for purpose versus visibility. In the first regime, definitions of success are operational: inputs, constraints, outcomes. In the second, definitions drift toward signs, badges, numbers, elegance of presentation. Where signs dominate means harden into rituals detached from ends. Time, sequence, and iteration versus spikes and events. The first regime privileges routines that accrete skill. The second chases moments engineered for notice. Iterative structure tolerates being unobserved. Event structure decays without spectators. Dependency, autonomy of effort versus mood governed by external ratings. The first regime stabilizes motivation by tying it to the work's internal logic. The second couples mood to fluctuating approval, producing cycles of overreach and collapse. Amour-propre tends to manufacture artificial needs, tokens that certify position without reducing lack. Typical markers include formats selected for optics, intentions announced before execution, tasks abandoned when witnesses fade, and collections of proof, certificates, likes, trophies, substituted for competence. Where these markers accumulate, practical intelligence declines, methods become theatrical, and attention migrates from the thing to its image. A minimal corrective protocol follows from Rousseau's analysis. Specification. Define tasks in concrete terms. What inputs are used, which constraints apply, what result counts as success. The definition should remain valid without mention of spectators. Sequence. Organize work into small, repeatable units that accumulate ability. Progress should be legible to the worker even in silence. Trace. Keep a private log sufficient for improvement, parameters, attempts, outcomes, next adjustments. The log must remain meaningful even if no one else reads it. These boundaries do not abolish recognition. They demote it to a byproduct. Esteem, when it appears, is accepted as residue of good work rather than fuel for continuation. Education in Rousseau's sense generalizes the protocol. The learner meets resistant reality first, then names it, then reflects. Flattery is delayed, so competence precedes reputation. Applied beyond schooling, the same order holds. Reversals of this order predict distortion. Where display precedes substance, dependency re-enters and scale is lost. 2 stress tests expose which motive governs without appealing to audience response. Silence test. Maintain a fixed period of practice with no outward communication. Stable output indicates attachment to the work, not to attention. Transfer test. Perform the same act across settings, alone, with peers, under scrutiny. Quality that remains constant indicates fitness criteria rather than theatrical ones. Rousseau's conclusion is austere but practical. Dignity grows where evaluation tracks reality closely and contracts where evaluation tracks esteem. The aim is not to purge social regard, but to prevent it from substituting for truth. The sufficient safeguard is procedural. Precise specifications, iterative schedules, and private traces that make improvement self-evident. Where these are in place, Amour de Soi governs by design. Where they are absent, Amour-propre quietly resumes control. Part 3. Emile and Education. From Contact to Character. Rousseau's educational program turns on a simple reversal. Ability should form from contact with resistant reality before it is decorated by reputation. Emile specifies the order. Experience arrow sequence, arrow judgment. So that knowledge answers to things, not to audience. The learner first meets objects and constraints. Only later are names, maxims, and praise introduced. Which parts of ordinary schooling invert this order and therefore train performance rather than competence? The target of critique is premature verbalism. Words detached from things, rules detached from use, approval detached from evidence. When instruction is optimized for display, learners acquire procedures that signal cleverness but collapse under load. Rousseau's answer is methodological rather than sentimental. Reduce mediation, restore proportion. Let the world instruct by offering feedback that cannot be negotiated. 3 structural elements define the method. 1. Materials before formulas. A child learns weight by lifting, heat by touching carefully, measure by fitting parts, not by reciting definitions. For adults, the analog is direct practice with tools, data, and tasks before theories of them. Does the definition still hold when the object resists? 2. Sequence before brilliance. Competence accumulates through small, repeatable units that preserve attention. Intervals are sized so that success depends on exactness, not on mood. Can the work proceed in the absence of spectators and without narrative inflation? 3. Consequence before command. Boundaries are presented as properties of reality, edges, limits, schedules, rather than as fluctuating expressions of a teacher's irritation? Does the rule translate into an observable difference in the result? Rousseau delays flattery on purpose. Early praise trains dependence on approval cycles. Delayed praise trains orientation to task quality. The aim is not to withdraw encouragement, but to place it after evidence, so that esteem becomes recognition of competence, not a substitute for it. Where encouragement precedes capability, vanity re-enters as motive, and the curriculum begins to orbit appearances. A practical curriculum follows the same logic for any age. Specify a skill in operational terms. Break it into iterations of fixed length. Let each unit end with a trace, a page, a pass, a test, sufficient for self-correction. Records remain private by default to prevent reputational economy from hijacking motive. When public proof is required, it appears as byproduct, not fuel. The teacher's role is primarily architectural. Arrange environments where accuracy is easier than display. Simpler rooms, clearer tools, visible clocks, stable procedures, few interruptions. Replace exhortations with settings that make the right action the path of least resistance. When environments are noisy, learners allocate attention to managing impressions. When environments are exact, attention returns to matter, time, and order. Rousseau's concept of freedom in education is equally functional. Freedom is not indulgence. It is room to meet reality without needless interference. The learner explores within boundaries that reflect the structure of the task. Autonomy grows because the source of correction is internal to the work, not dependent on fluctuating approval. 2 tests reveal whether an educational practice is aligned with this program. Stability test. Does the quality of work remain steady across settings, alone, supervised, observed, indicating orientation to standards rather than to gaze? Transfer test. Do skills acquired in one context function under different constraints, indicating contact with principles rather than with stage directions? In Emile, the product of this order is not a prodigy, but a reliable adult. Judgments proportioned to facts, appetites proportioned to needs, and a will trained to prefer exactness over spectacle. Where such habits take root, contact before language, sequence before show, consequence before command, character thickens like tree rings. Where the order reverses, character thins and displays grow loud. Which order governs your present learning, and what would change if evidence were restored to the first position? Part 4. Social contract and the general will. Rousseau's political claim begins with a definition of freedom. Not license, but hostile obedience to a law one prescribes to oneself, together with others. The social contract is the rule by which isolated strength is converted into civic right. Its core concept, the general will, does not equal the arithmetical sum of private preferences, will of all. It is the rule that targets the common good under descriptions that apply to each citizen as an equal. A measure qualifies as general when it is expressed in universal terms for all of this class, and when its aim is the conditions of shared life rather than the advantage of a faction. This distinction yields design principles. First, generality of law. Statutes must regulate categories and procedures, not persons by name. Second, public reason. Justification must be offerable in terms that any citizen could, in principle, accept without humiliation. Third, non-delegable sovereignty. The people determine the ends, laws in general terms, while magistrates administer means, execution and adjudication. When these roles collapse, private interests colonize public forms. Rousseau is not naive about danger. Majorities can behave like factions. Applause can masquerade as legitimacy, hence scale and virtue. Political units should be human-sized enough to sustain recognition and accountability. Civic character must be cultivated so that citizens can prefer just rules to immediate gain. Practices that train this preference are plain. Rotation of offices, clear procedures adopted before specific disputes, transparent minutes, reasons recorded rather than shouted, penalties that strike categories rather than enemies. 2 diagnostic errors mark departures from the general will. Particularization occurs when a measure smuggles in proper names or surrogates for them, features designed to include friends and exclude rivals. Performative sovereignty occurs when leaders stage popular consent through spectacle instead of submitting proposals to open, rule-bound decision. Where either dominates, the contract still exists in form, but not in substance. A civic test suite follows from the theory. Generality test. Can the rule be stated without reference to persons? And would you accept it under role uncertainty? Publicity test. Could the full reasoning for the rule be published without exposing an illicit partiality? Reversibility test. If the parties traded places, would the rules still be defended on the same grounds? Failure on anyone indicates that the will expressed is sectional, not general. Rousseau's account also limits coercion. Because citizens are authors of the law, lawful constraint is not alien force, but the community's demand. Make it that each person be the citizen they have already willed themselves to be. This does not sanctify harshness. It conditions legitimacy on procedure. Where rules are general, reasons public, and offices restrained by law, obedience preserves freedom. Where rules aim at enemies, reasons hide, and offices improvise powers, obedience becomes servility. The model implies ordinary maintenance rather than permanent fervor. The contract is kept by schedules, archives, budgets, and boundaries that leave as little as possible to mood. A polity that treats disagreement as a defect of loyalty will cannibalize the general will. A polity that treats procedures as the site of common dignity can absorb conflict without humiliation. The practical question is narrow and decisive. Do existing institutions make it easier to act for the common good than to perform for a faction? Where the answer is yes, freedom as shared authorship is alive. Where it is no, the vocabulary of freedom remains while its substance drains away. Rousseau's argument resolves into a sequence of calibrations. First, distinguish baselines. In nature, needs are limited in proportion to use. In society, comparison introduces artificial demands and converts actions into signs. The practical aim is not retreat, but scale. Restore contact with reality so that conduct answers to things before it answers to esteem. Which of your standing goals retains its priority when prestige variables are removed from the calculation? Second, sort motives. Amour de Soi measures by fitness for purpose. Amour-propre measures by visibility. The former shortens feedback loops and compounds learning. The latter lengthens loops and ties mood to audiences. Where definitions of success drift toward optics, methods harden into ceremonies that no longer serve their ends. Which procedures in your routine survive if no record of them is kept? Third, reform education. Materials precede formulas. Iteration precedes brilliance. Consequence precedes command. Praise is delayed so that reputation becomes recognition of evidence rather than a surrogate for it. Which part of your training still asks for proof before there is performance? Fourth, specify the political form. Freedom is preserved when citizens obey general laws they co-author. The general will is identified by universality of rule, publicity of reasons, and restraint of offices to procedure. Where measures name factions, directly or by proxy, sovereignty becomes performance and the contract thins to rhetoric. Which local rule would still be defended if roles were exchanged? The thread across these domains is proportion, need size to life, motive size to function, learning size to reality, law size to the common good. To keep proportion is to maintain dignity without spectacle. The closing test is spare and sufficient. Does this act answer to life rather than to display? And could it be chosen under the same reasons in private and in public? If yes, Rousseau's standard is met. If not, the remedy is the same as the thesis. Reduce mediation, restore contact, and let form follow truth.